I was visiting my childhood home when my mom asked, "Do you remember your imaginary friend?" The coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten breakfast before school for 12 years, and she'd just asked the question so casually, like she was asking about the weather. But her hands were shaking slightly as she stirred her own coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic in a rhythm that was just a bit too fast. I set my cup down carefully and told her I didn't know what she was talking about. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, and said surely I remembered Oliver, my friend from when I was little. The name hit me like a physical blow even though I had no conscious memory of anyone called Oliver. My chest tightened, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I asked her why she was bringing this up now, after all these years, and she just kept stirring her coffee, around and around, staring into it like she could find answers in the dark liquid. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "I found his things in the basement. I think it's time you knew the truth." I'd been visiting my parents for the weekend, something I did maybe 3 or 4 times a year since moving across the state for work. My dad had passed away 6 months earlier from lung cancer, and Mom had been struggling with the emptiness of the house. She was 68 now, her hair completely gray, and she'd lost weight since Dad died. The house felt different without him, quieter and somehow smaller, like it was shrinking in on itself. I'd arrived Friday evening and we'd spent the night watching old movies and talking about Dad, sharing memories and looking through photo albums. It had been nice, normal, the kind of visit I'd expected. But Saturday morning, she'd woken me up early, insisting we have coffee together before I left, and now she was talking about an imaginary friend I had no memory of, and things hidden in the basement. I asked her what things she was talking about, and she stood up without answering, motioning for me to follow her. My legs felt heavy as I walked behind her toward the basement door, that same door I'd been told never to open as a child, because the stairs were dangerous, and the basement was just storage. The basement stairs creaked under our weight, and the air got colder with each step down. Mom pulled the chain on the single overhead bulb, and weak yellow light spilled across boxes and old furniture covered in dust sheets. She walked straight to the far corner, where a small wooden chest sat on a shelf I'd never noticed before. It was maybe 2 feet long, made of dark wood with tarnished brass hinges, and it looked old in a way that suggested it had been deliberately hidden rather than forgotten. Mom lifted it down carefully, like it might break, and set it on top of a nearby box. When she opened it, I saw children's toys inside. A small wooden train, some marbles in a glass jar, a worn stuffed rabbit, and underneath those, a stack of photographs held together with a rubber band that had deteriorated with age. She handed me the photos without a word, and I started looking through them. Most showed me as a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, playing in the backyard or sitting at the kitchen table. But in every single photo, there was another boy with me, same age, with dark curly hair and brown eyes, smiling at the camera like he belonged there. My hands started shaking as I flipped through photo after photo. There were at least 20 pictures, spanning what looked like several years, and this other boy was in all of them. We were playing together, sitting together, eating together. In one photo, we were dressed in matching Halloween costumes. In another, we were opening Christmas presents side by side. I asked Mom who this was, and she said it was Oliver, that I'd called him my best friend. But I had no memory of him at all, not a single fragment of recognition. I asked her if he was a neighbor kid or a cousin I'd forgotten about, and she shook her head slowly. She said Oliver had lived with us for 3 years, that he'd been like a second son to her, and then one day he was just gone. I felt like the floor was tilting under me. How could I have no memory of someone I'd spent 3 years with? How could I forget a person who was clearly such a big part of my childhood? Mom's eyes were filling with tears, and she said there was more I needed to know, but she didn't know how to tell me. I told her to just say it, whatever it was, because the not knowing was worse than anything she could tell me. She took a deep breath and said Oliver wasn't imaginary, and he wasn't a neighbor. He was my twin brother. The words didn't make sense at first, like she was speaking another language. I told her that was impossible, that I didn't have a brother, that I'd grown up as an only child. But she pulled out another photo from the bottom of the chest, this one showing her heavily pregnant, and then a hospital photo of her holding 2 infants wrapped in blue blankets. She pointed to the notation on the back, Ethan and Oliver, April 15th, 1992, my birth date, my name, and another name I'd never heard before. I sat down hard on a dusty box, my legs unable to hold me up anymore. I asked her what happened to him, where he went, and why no one had ever told me I had a twin brother. She was crying openly now, and she said Oliver had been taken away when we were 8 years old, that it was complicated, that she and Dad had made choices they thought were right at the time. I asked her what choices, and she said Child Protective Services had removed him from our home after a teacher reported suspicious injuries, that he'd been placed with a foster family and eventually adopted, that we'd been forbidden from contacting him as part of the agreement. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The basement felt like it was spinning. I had a twin brother who'd been taken away by CPS when I was 8, and I had no memory of it. No memory of him existing, no memory of him leaving, nothing. I asked Mom why I couldn't remember any of this, and she looked away, unable to meet my eyes. She said I'd been very traumatized by Oliver's removal, that I'd cried for weeks and had nightmares, that I'd kept asking when he was coming home. The child psychologist they'd taken me to said I was experiencing severe separation anxiety and recommended they stop talking about Oliver entirely, let me adjust to him being gone. Over time, she said, I seemed to forget about him completely, and they'd convinced themselves it was for the best. They'd packed away all evidence of Oliver's existence and never spoke his name again. I felt sick. My parents had essentially erased my brother from my life, let me grow up thinking I was an only child. And now, 34 years later, my mother was telling me the truth because she'd found his things while cleaning out the basement. I asked her why she was telling me now, and she said because she was dying. She had pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 2 weeks ago, and she didn't want to die with this secret. She wanted me to know the truth before it was too late. I left the basement and walked outside, needing air, needing space, needing to process what I'd just learned. The backyard looked the same as it always had, the same old swing set that was too small for me now, the same oak tree I'd climbed as a kid, but everything felt different knowing Oliver had been here too, that we'd played together in this yard, swung on those swings together, climbed that tree together, and I couldn't remember any of it. I called my wife Rachel from my cell phone, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong from my voice. I told her I needed to come home, that I'd explain when I got there, and she said she'd be waiting. I went back inside and told Mom I was leaving, that I needed time to think about all this. She grabbed my hand and begged me not to hate her, said she and Dad had done what they thought was best, that the situation had been impossible. I pulled my hand away and asked her why Oliver was taken away in the first place, what had happened to him. She said she couldn't talk about it, that there were things I didn't understand, and I told her I was done with secrets. If she wanted any kind of relationship with me going forward, she needed to tell me everything. She sat down at the kitchen table and told me that Oliver had been different from birth, more difficult, more demanding, and as we got older, the differences became more pronounced. I was quiet and easy, she said, but Oliver was wild and angry and sometimes violent. He'd had meltdowns where he'd destroy things or hurt himself, and my dad had lost his temper more than once trying to discipline him. She said they'd tried everything, different doctors and therapists and medications, but nothing helped. And then one day, Oliver had shown up to school with bruises on his arms, and when the teacher asked him about it, he'd said our dad had grabbed him. CPS had investigated, and while they couldn't prove ongoing abuse, they'd determined that Oliver would be better off in another home, especially since he seemed to be struggling in our family dynamic. My parents had fought it at first, she said, but eventually they'd agreed because Oliver seemed so unhappy with us, and they thought maybe a fresh start would help him. I asked her if Dad had actually hurt Oliver, and she was quiet for a long time before saying that discipline had been different back then, that what they'd done wasn't considered abuse at the time, but yes, Dad had probably been too rough with him sometimes. I drove home in a daze, barely remembering the 3-hour trip. Rachel was waiting in the living room, and when I walked in, she stood up immediately, seeing my face. I told her everything, starting from Mom's question about the imaginary friend and ending with the revelation that I had a twin brother who'd been removed from our home because of abuse. She listened without interrupting, her hand over her mouth, her eyes getting wider as I talked. When I finished, she asked me what I was going to do, and I said I didn't know. I didn't even know where to start. She suggested I talk to a therapist, someone who specialized in repressed memories, because it wasn't normal to have zero recollection of a sibling I'd spent 8 years with. She said my brain had probably blocked it out as a trauma response, and I might be able to recover some of those memories with help. I agreed and started searching for therapists that night, eventually finding Dr. Philip Novak, a clinical psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma and memory recovery. His office was in the city, about 40 minutes from our house, and he had an opening the following week. The days between Mom's revelation and my first appointment with Dr. Novak were surreal. I kept pulling out the photos Mom had given me, studying Oliver's face, trying to feel some recognition or connection. But he was a stranger to me, just another kid in old photos. Rachel suggested I try to find him, to see if he was okay and maybe reconnect, but I didn't even know where to start looking. Mom had said he'd been adopted, which meant his name had probably been changed, and I had no idea what family had taken him. I called Mom and asked if she had any information about Oliver's adoptive family, and she said no, that the adoption had been closed, and they weren't allowed to have any contact or information. She sounded weaker on the phone than she had in person, and I felt a pang of guilt for being angry with her when she was dying. But I couldn't just forgive what she and Dad had done, erasing my brother from existence and letting me grow up not knowing he existed. I asked her if she had any other photos or documents related to Oliver, and she said she'd look through the basement more carefully and let me know what she found. Dr. Novak's office was in a converted Victorian house with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that was probably meant to be calming, but just made me more anxious. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he had the kind of calm, measured demeanor that probably came from decades of listening to people's trauma. I told him about discovering Oliver's existence and my complete lack of memory about him, and he listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he explained that what I was describing sounded like dissociative amnesia, a condition where the brain blocks out traumatic memories as a protective mechanism. He said it was relatively rare for someone to forget an entire person, especially a twin sibling, but given the circumstances, the sudden removal, the trauma of separation, and my parents' deliberate erasure of Oliver from my life, it made sense. He said we could try some techniques to help recover those memories, but he warned me that it might be painful and that some memories might stay buried regardless of what we tried. We started with guided visualization, Dr. Novak asking me to close my eyes and try to picture my childhood home, to walk through it in my mind and notice any details that stood out. At first, I just saw the house as I remembered it from my later childhood and teen years, empty and quiet. But as we kept working, session after session, small details started emerging. I remembered a second bed in my room, even though I'd always slept in a single bed as far as I knew. I remembered the sound of someone crying at night, not me, but someone else close by. I remembered my mom reading 2 different bedtime stories instead of one, though I couldn't remember who the second story was for. Dr. Novak said these were good signs, that my memories were starting to surface, and we needed to be patient and let them come naturally. Over the next month, more fragments appeared. I remembered playing with someone in the backyard, remembered sharing toys, remembered arguments over whose turn it was for something, but the memories were hazy and disconnected, like watching a movie with half the scenes missing. During this time, I did some research into CPS records and found out that in my state, biological parents could request information about children who'd been removed from their care, especially if those children were now adults. I contacted a family law attorney named Garrett Flynn, who specialized in adoption and family reunification cases. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with an energetic way of talking that suggested he was genuinely interested in helping people. I explained my situation, and he said he could file a request with the state to see if they'd release information about Oliver's placement and adoption. He warned me that it might take months, and that there was no guarantee the state would cooperate, especially since the adoption had been finalized decades ago. But he said it was worth trying, and he'd seen successful reunifications in similar cases. I hired him on the spot and gave him all the information I had, which wasn't much: Oliver's name, our birth date, and the approximate year he'd been removed from our home. Mom's cancer was progressing faster than expected. She'd started chemotherapy, but the doctors weren't optimistic about her prognosis. I visited her every weekend, and each time she looked smaller and frailer. We talked about Oliver during those visits, and she slowly revealed more details. She told me that Oliver had been scared of Dad, that he'd hide in the closet when Dad came home from work. She said there had been incidents where Dad had lost his temper and grabbed Oliver hard enough to leave marks, and that she'd made excuses for the bruises when other people asked. She said she'd always meant to protect both of us but didn't know how, and she'd convinced herself that letting Oliver go to a different family was the right choice. I asked her if she'd ever tried to find out what happened to him after the adoption, and she admitted she had, once, about 10 years ago. She'd hired a private investigator who'd found that Oliver had been adopted by a family named the Harpers, and that his name had been changed to Daniel Harper. But when she'd gotten that information, she'd been too scared to do anything with it, afraid of what it might mean for our family if the truth came out. She'd hidden the investigator's report in her safe deposit box at the bank. I got access to Mom's safe deposit box with her permission and found the private investigator's report. It was dated 2014 and included basic information about Oliver's adoptive family. The Harpers lived in Oregon, about 600 miles away. The father, Kenneth Harper, was a high school teacher, and the mother, Patricia Harper, was a nurse. They'd adopted Oliver when he was 9 years old, about a year after he'd been removed from our home. The report included their last known address and phone number, though that information was now 10 years old and probably outdated. The investigator had also noted that Oliver, now Daniel, had graduated from high school in 2010 and had attended community college, but there was no information about where he was currently living or what he was doing. I showed the report to Garrett Flynn, and he said this was extremely helpful, that he could use this information to try to locate Daniel and potentially facilitate contact if Daniel was willing. I asked him to move forward with it, my heart pounding at the thought of potentially meeting my twin brother after 34 years. Meanwhile, my sessions with Dr. Novak were becoming more intense. We'd moved beyond visualization to more direct memory work, and some of what was surfacing was disturbing. I remembered hiding under my bed with someone else, both of us trying to be quiet while our dad yelled about something. I remembered seeing bruises on someone's arms and being told not to talk about them. I remembered a social worker coming to our house and asking me questions while my parents watched nervously. I remembered the day Oliver was taken away, though the memory was fragmented and confused. I saw a woman leading him out the front door while he cried and reached back toward me. I remembered screaming and trying to run after him, and my mom holding me back, her arms tight around me while I thrashed and sobbed. The memory hit me so hard during the session that I started crying, really crying, for the first time since all this started. Dr. Novak let me sit with it, and when I finally calmed down, he said this was a breakthrough, that I was starting to access the core trauma that my brain had been protecting me from. Garrett called me 6 weeks after I'd hired him with news. He'd located Daniel Harper living in Seattle, working as a software engineer. He was married with 2 kids, and according to public records, seemed to be doing well. Garrett said he'd sent a preliminary letter to Daniel explaining that a biological family member was trying to make contact and asking if Daniel would be open to communication. He warned me not to get my hopes up, that many adoptees weren't interested in reconnecting with biological families, especially if there had been trauma involved in the separation. I thanked him and tried to prepare myself for the possibility that Daniel might not want anything to do with me. After all, why would he? Our parents had abused him, then let him be taken away, and I'd apparently forgotten he existed entirely. If I were him, I probably wouldn't want contact either, but I couldn't help hoping. This was my brother, my twin, someone I'd shared the first 8 years of my life with, and I desperately wanted to know him again. 2 weeks later, Garrett called to say he'd received a response from Daniel. He was willing to talk, but he wanted to do it through a mediator first, not directly. He'd suggested a family therapist who specialized in adoption reunification, a woman named Dr. Claire Richardson, who practiced in Seattle. Garrett had already contacted her, and she was willing to work with us if we were interested. I immediately agreed and booked a flight to Seattle for the following month. Rachel wanted to come with me, but I thought this was something I needed to do alone, at least for the first meeting. She understood and helped me prepare, researching reunion best practices and helping me write down questions I wanted to ask Daniel. The night before my flight, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. What would he look like? Would we have anything in common? Would he be angry with me for forgetting him? Would he blame me for not protecting him from our father? I had no idea what to expect, and that uncertainty was almost worse than not knowing he existed at all. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Dr. Richardson's office was modern and bright, completely different from Dr. Novak's Victorian house. She met me in the waiting room, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and a warm smile. She explained that Daniel was already in her office and that she'd bring us together when everyone was ready. She asked me how I was feeling, and I admitted I was terrified. She said that was normal, and that we'd take things at whatever pace felt comfortable for everyone. When she finally led me into her office, I saw him sitting in one of the chairs near the window, and it was like looking at an alternate version of myself. We had the same dark hair, though his was cut shorter, the same build, the same basic facial features, but his eyes were different somehow, harder, more guarded. We stared at each other for a long moment before Dr. Richardson suggested we sit down and talk about what we hoped to get out of this meeting. Daniel spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. He said he'd been shocked to get Garrett's letter, that he'd spent years trying to move past his early childhood and hadn't expected anyone from his biological family to ever reach out. He said he had some memories of our time together, though they were mixed with a lot of painful experiences. He remembered our father being violent and our mother being unable or unwilling to protect us. He said he'd spent years in therapy working through the trauma of those early years, and that meeting me was bringing up a lot of complicated feelings. I apologized for not remembering him, tried to explain about the dissociative amnesia and how I'd only just learned about his existence a few months ago. He looked skeptical, and I could tell he thought I was making excuses or lying. Dr. Richardson intervened, explaining that what I was describing was a documented psychological phenomenon, and that my lack of memory didn't mean I hadn't cared about him or that his experiences weren't valid. Daniel seemed to relax slightly, though he was still clearly on guard. I asked him what he remembered about our childhood, and he took a deep breath before answering. He said he remembered our father hitting him, mostly with a belt, but sometimes with his fists. He remembered hiding in closets and under beds, trying to stay quiet so he wouldn't attract attention. He said I had been different, quieter, and more compliant, and that Dad had seemed to favor me as a result. He said he'd felt like there was something wrong with him, that he deserved the punishment, because everyone seemed to think he was the problem child. When CPS had removed him, he'd been relieved at first, glad to get away from our father, but then he'd realized he was leaving me behind, and that had terrified him. He'd tried to tell the social workers that I needed to be taken away too, that I wasn't safe, but they'd said I showed no signs of abuse and that I seemed well-adjusted. He'd spent years feeling guilty for leaving me in that house, worried about what our father might do to me without him there to take the brunt of it. Hearing this made me feel sick. While I'd been living a relatively normal childhood, completely unaware that I'd had a brother, Daniel had been carrying guilt about abandoning me. I told him that our father had never hit me, at least not that I remembered, that after he left, our household had been quiet and calm, and I'd had what I thought was a normal, happy childhood. Daniel's expression changed, something like anger flickering across his face. He said of course Dad hadn't hit me after he was gone, because I was the good son, the one who didn't cause problems. He said he'd been the scapegoat, the one who took all the punishment so I could stay safe. Dr. Richardson gently pointed out that we'd both been children, and neither of us was responsible for our father's actions. She said it wasn't productive to compare our experiences or assign blame, that we'd both been victims of a dysfunctional family system in different ways. Daniel apologized for his tone, but I could tell he was still struggling with resentment. I asked him about his life after the adoption, trying to shift to more positive territory. He softened a bit and told me about the Harpers, who'd been good parents, patient, and loving in ways our biological parents had never been. He said they'd helped him heal and given him stability, and he was grateful for that. He'd kept the name they'd given him because it represented his new life, the person he'd become after escaping our family. We talked for almost 3 hours, Dr. Richardson occasionally asking questions or redirecting when the conversation got too heated. By the end, we'd agreed to stay in touch via email and potentially meet again in a few months after we'd both had time to process. Daniel gave me his email address, and I gave him mine. As we were leaving, he turned to me and said he was glad I'd found him, even though it was complicated. He said he'd wondered about me over the years, hoped I was okay, and it was good to know I was. I told him I was sorry for everything he'd been through, and that I wished I could remember our time together, remember being his brother when he needed one. He just nodded and walked away, and I watched him go, feeling like I'd found something precious and lost it again all in the same day. I flew home emotionally exhausted, unsure what would happen next, but grateful that at least Daniel knew I hadn't forgotten him intentionally. Mom died 3 weeks after my meeting with Daniel. The cancer had spread too fast for the chemotherapy to help, and she'd chosen to stop treatment and enter hospice care at home. I spent her last days sitting by her bedside, and we talked more about Oliver, about the choices she and Dad had made, about the guilt she'd carried all these years. She said she'd never forgiven herself for letting Oliver be taken away, that she'd known Dad was too rough with him, but hadn't had the courage to stand up to Dad or protect Oliver the way she should have. She asked me to tell Oliver, if I ever got the chance, that she was sorry, that she'd loved him, even though her actions hadn't shown it. I promised I would, and she died peacefully a few days later, holding my hand. At her funeral, I found myself thinking about the brother who wasn't there, who'd been erased from our family so completely that no one at the service even knew he'd existed. I sent Daniel an email letting him know that our mother had passed and what she'd said about him. He didn't respond for a week, and when he did, he simply said thank you, and that he hoped she'd found peace. After Mom's death, I inherited the house and spent weeks going through her belongings. In her bedroom closet, I found more photos of Oliver, tucked into shoeboxes and old purses, hidden away where Dad wouldn't see them. She'd kept them all these years, looking at them secretly, remembering the son she'd given up. I scanned every photo and sent the digital files to Daniel, thinking he might want them, even if the memories attached to them were painful. He thanked me and said he didn't have any photos from before his adoption, that the Harpers had started fresh with him, and he'd assumed all evidence of his early life had been destroyed. Having these photos meant more than I could know, he said. We started emailing more regularly after that, cautious conversations about our current lives, our jobs, our families. He sent me photos of his kids, 2 little girls who looked like both of us, and I sent him photos of the house we'd grown up in, now empty and waiting to be sold. Dr. Novak and I continued our work, and more memories surfaced. I remembered Oliver being my best friend, my constant companion, the person I played with every day. I remembered how he'd been braver than me, more willing to stand up to Dad even though it meant getting punished. I remembered how he'd protected me sometimes, taking blame for things I'd done so I wouldn't get in trouble. The memories were bittersweet, precious, because they proved that Oliver had been real and important to me, but painful, because I'd lost all those years of knowing him. Dr. Novak said the memories were probably always there, just locked away, and that finding Oliver again had given my brain permission to access them. He said the process of reunification was healing for both of us, even though it was difficult. I asked him if I'd ever remember everything, and he said probably not, that some memories were too deeply buried or too fragmented to fully recover. But what I did remember was enough to rebuild a connection with my brother, and that was what mattered. 6 months after our first meeting, Daniel agreed to visit me at the house where we'd grown up. Rachel and I had been living there temporarily while we decided whether to sell it or rent it out, and I thought it might help Daniel to see it again, to confront those old demons in a safe environment. He flew in with his wife, a kind woman named Jenna who worked as a teacher, and they stayed at a hotel near our house. The first day, we just talked, getting to know each other better, sharing stories about our lives. Daniel told me more about his adoption, how difficult the transition had been at first, how the Harpers had gotten him into therapy immediately and never given up on him even when he acted out. He said he'd struggled with anger and trust issues for years, but they'd been patient, and eventually he'd learned that not all adults would hurt him. Jenna added that Daniel had told her about his early childhood years ago, and she'd been supportive when he'd decided to meet me, even though she'd been worried about him being re-traumatized. The second day of their visit, we went to the house. Daniel stood in the driveway for a long moment, staring at the building like he was seeing a ghost. He said it looked smaller than he remembered, older and more run down. We walked through together, and I watched his face as he took in each room. In the kitchen, he stopped and pointed to a corner near the pantry. He said that was where Dad had cornered him once, yelling at him for spilling juice. In the living room, he showed me where he used to hide behind the couch when things got bad. Upstairs, in what had been our bedroom, he stood in the doorway and said this was where he'd felt safest, because we'd been together. He said he remembered lying in bed at night, talking to me about nothing and everything, making plans for when we grew up. I told him I was starting to remember those conversations too, fragments of them anyway, and his eyes got wet. We stood there in that empty room, two grown men crying for the children we'd been, and for all the years we'd lost. Before they left, Daniel said he wanted to do something. He asked if we could take a photo together, something we could both keep, a new memory to replace the painful old ones. We stood in the backyard under the oak tree we'd apparently climbed together as kids, and Jenna took our picture. Looking at it later, I was struck by how similar we looked despite 34 years of living completely different lives. We had the same smile, the same way of standing, the same genes expressing themselves in the same ways. Daniel sent me a long email after he got home, thanking me for finding him, for giving him the chance to reclaim this part of his history. He said meeting me had helped him realize that he wasn't defined by what had happened in our childhood, that he could acknowledge that part of his life without being destroyed by it. He said he'd like us to build a real relationship going forward, not as strangers who happened to share DNA, but as brothers who'd found their way back to each other despite everything. We started video calling once a month, then twice a month, then weekly. Rachel and the kids got to know Daniel and Jenna, and our families started planning visits. I told Daniel everything I remembered about our childhood, and he filled in the gaps with his own memories, creating a more complete picture of who we'd been together. He told me about a time I'd defended him to a kid at school who was making fun of him. I told him about a memory of him teaching me to tie my shoes because Mom was always too busy. We pieced together our shared history, reclaiming it from the erasure our parents had imposed. Dr. Novak said this was exactly what healing looked like, taking trauma and transforming it into connection. He said many people never got the chance to reunite with lost family members, and we were lucky to have found each other again while we were both still young enough to build something meaningful. A year after finding out about Oliver's existence, I stood at my father's grave with Daniel beside me. We'd never done this before, never visited the cemetery together, and I'd been unsure whether Daniel would want to, but he'd said he needed to close that chapter of his life properly. We stood there in silence for a long time, both of us thinking about the man buried beneath that stone and what he'd done to us. Daniel finally spoke, saying he'd spent years hating our father, wishing terrible things would happen to him, but now he just felt nothing. Dad was gone. The power he'd had over Daniel was gone, and all that was left was a name on a gravestone. I said I felt guilty that I'd had good memories of Dad while Daniel had only painful ones, that it seemed unfair. Daniel said it wasn't my fault, that kids couldn't control how their parents treated them. He said what mattered now was that we were building something better, a relationship based on honesty and choice rather than biology and obligation. We started a tradition of getting together every few months, alternating between Seattle and our area. Our kids became close, cousins who actually knew each other instead of strangers at occasional family gatherings. Daniel and I discovered we had a lot in common despite our different upbringings. The same sense of humor, similar tastes in music, the same way of processing problems by talking them through. Rachel said it was uncanny how alike we were, and Jenna agreed. They became friends too, bonding over their experiences of supporting us through this journey. During one visit, Daniel's older daughter asked why we hadn't grown up together if we were twins, and Daniel and I looked at each other, unsure how to explain it. We eventually told her a simplified version, that we'd lived in different houses when we were kids because of grown-up problems, but now we were friends again. She seemed satisfied with that answer, and I was grateful we didn't have to get into the full, painful truth. I sold our childhood home and split the proceeds with Daniel, even though legally he had no claim to it. He tried to refuse at first, but I insisted. This house had been bought with money our parents had earned while raising both of us, and he deserved half. He finally accepted and used his portion as a down payment on a bigger house for his growing family. We met at the closing, and after we signed all the papers, we went back to the house one last time before the new owners took possession. We walked through the empty rooms, our footsteps echoing on the bare floors, and said goodbye to the place that held so much pain and so few good memories. As we locked the door for the last time, Daniel said he was glad to be done with it, glad to leave it behind. I agreed. The house had been part of our past, but it didn't define our future. We'd both built lives beyond those walls, and now we were building a relationship that had nothing to do with the trauma that had separated us. Dr. Novak eventually discharged me from active therapy, saying I'd made remarkable progress in recovering my memories and processing the trauma of losing and finding my brother. He said I might want to come back occasionally for maintenance sessions, especially during stressful times, but that I'd developed good coping skills and a strong support system. My last session with him felt like a graduation of sorts, a recognition that I'd done the hard work of facing my past and come out stronger for it. I thanked him for everything he'd done, and he said I'd done the work myself. He'd just guided me through it. As I left his office for the last time, I thought about the person I'd been a year and a half ago, someone who didn't know he had a twin brother, who'd lived his whole life with a piece of himself missing and hadn't even known it. I was different now, more complete, even though the journey to get here had been incredibly painful. Daniel and I never talked about our parents much after that first year. We'd said what needed to be said, processed what needed to be processed, and moved on. Our relationship wasn't about them anymore. It was about us, about being brothers in the present, rather than dwelling on how we'd been separated in the past. We had inside jokes and shared interests and genuine affection for each other, things that developed naturally rather than being forced out of obligation. His kids called me Uncle Ethan, and mine called him Uncle Daniel, and that felt right in a way that biology alone never could have. We'd chosen each other, continued choosing each other, and that choice meant more than any genetic connection. On what would have been our 40th birthday, we celebrated together for the first time since we were 8 years old. Both families gathered at a restaurant, and we ordered too much food and laughed too loud and took so many photos that the waiter asked if it was some kind of reunion. Daniel looked at me across the table, raised his glass, and said it was exactly that. A reunion of brothers who'd been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, but had found their way back to each other despite impossible odds. Everyone clinked glasses, and I felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude for the series of events that had led to this moment. If Mom hadn't been diagnosed with cancer, she might never have told me about Oliver. If I hadn't found those photos in the basement, I might have continued living my entire life not knowing my brother existed. If Daniel hadn't been willing to meet me, to take the risk of opening old wounds, we wouldn't be sitting here together now. So many things had to go right for us to get here, and somehow, against all odds, they had. Later that night, after everyone else had gone home, Daniel and I sat on my back porch drinking beer and watching the stars. He said he'd been thinking about writing a memoir about his experiences in foster care and adoption, something that might help other kids going through similar situations. I told him I thought that was a great idea, and that I'd support him however I could. He asked if I'd be willing to write the foreword, sharing my perspective as the brother who'd been left behind and had forgotten. I said I'd be honored. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then he said something that stuck with me. He said that for years, he'd felt incomplete, like there was a part of him missing that he couldn't name. Meeting me again had filled that void, had made him feel whole in a way he hadn't since childhood. I told him I felt the same way, that I'd always had this vague sense that something was wrong or missing, but I couldn't identify what it was. Now I knew. It had been him, my brother, my twin, the other half of who I was supposed to be. The last time I spoke to Dr. Novak, I asked him if he thought I'd ever remember everything about my childhood with Oliver. He said probably not, that some memories were lost permanently, but that it didn't matter as much as I thought it did. What mattered was that Daniel and I were building new memories together, creating a shared history going forward that would eventually be more important than the years we'd lost. He said focusing on what we had now, rather than what we'd missed, was the key to moving forward without resentment or regret. I took his advice to heart and stopped trying so hard to force the old memories to surface. Instead, I focused on being present with Daniel, on creating moments worth remembering, rather than chasing shadows of a past I could barely grasp. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.